Recording in progress.
There is Martin, and online we have Rob and Lucas. You want to say hello and wave, or?
Afternoon, everyone.
Hi.
Good. So what we're going to do is we have been putting together a draft case statement to create a working group on trusted/secure research environments that will allow us to handle confidentially with sensitive or confidential data. And what we'll do today is, so the case statement has been submitted, we got some feedback, so that's fine. What we want to do today is basically run you briefly through what we've done so far, so kind of the genesis of the case statement and the problems that we spotted that we want to address. And then go step by step through the case statement to get your feedback, both online as well as in the room, on things that you would suggest to change, things that we should phrase slightly differently to make it clear what we want to do, avoid misunderstandings, but also gauge your interest in any of the topics that we are addressing and whether you would like to join the team in working on those exciting challenges. For the people online, I do see the chat behind me, so I will try to monitor that, but if there is anything you would like to say, just shout out, and we should hear you in the room. And I hope that way you can participate in the discussion, even if I should not notice immediately if there is something posted on the chat. Okay, good, let's get started. The agenda. Short summary of what we've done so far, the BoF sessions at P20 and P21, Gothenburg and Salzburg, and then the planned work group activities, discussing what we want to do, finalizing the case statement for submission. So this was how it all started. First BoF session in a room for about, 40 people originally, in which more than 70 people packed into. It was really a really cool debate on trying to figure out what we want to do, and there was lots of ideas floating around, things that need to be addressed, things that are causing troubles for TREs. And so what we tried to do in the aftermath of that quite turbulent discussion, very inspiring discussion, is to condense it a little bit and nail it down to a number of more tangible problems that we can actually reasonably address, or we think we can address within the lifetime of a working group. So that is what we set up there. And basically, the summary or the insights were basically that there is a lot of TREs or SREs out there in the world already, in the medical sciences, but also other disciplines, social sciences. Industry has similar setups in many cases. And they're very, very similar, but not identical. They all operate following certain principles, inserting certain controls to keep the data secure, to ensure that the operations are safe, how they check people who get access to, how they approve access to data, or how they approve certain research projects. Similar but not identical. And what we wanted to understand, for example, where the differences are and what the impact is and how we can make them interoperable. Because those TREs, they won't be running in isolation where there is one TRE and specific researchers work just with that one TRE. We will need to face situations where we need to combine data from two TREs, where researchers interact with more than one. How can we facilitate that a bit better? And so we want to get a better understanding of how are they similar, where are they different, and why are they different? Is it due to national legislation? Is it due to different target groups, different types of data? What are the commonalities? What are the differences? What are the levels of security? Are there differing levels of security? Are there differing risks that they are facing? And what are the controls that we need to establish? So those are the questions that we wanted to address. Then came the second BoF session in Salzburg, where we basically tried to condense this ultimately to 4 problem areas that we wanted to address. And these are the ones that I want to present you briefly. But basically what we want to do is we want to bring together those groups that operate TREs, SREs, or that use TREs, SREs, or they're responsible for hosting them, for managing them, in order to really understand how can we ensure efficient and fair, transparent, auditable science with data that cannot be shared publicly, that cannot be distributed and across the world, basically. So we want to bring together infrastructure providers that enable those kind of data visiting settings, data stewards that curate metadata, because we need to understand what kind of metadata can be released publicly and which metadata is too sensitive to release publicly. Data owners who want to provide access to data but don't necessarily have the means to do so. What do they want so that they can entrust their data to a certain TRE environment? And researchers who will need to find and have a process how to get access, request access to sensitive data, so that also those processes are kind of harmonized and then we don't face a different structure at each TRE that we want to work with. So this is basically the value proposition that we want to put forward. Enabling efficient, high-quality research, fair research, capital fair, even if the data is not openly and widely distributable and shareable. And so we collected in the first stages a number of TREs. There's surprisingly many. In some of them very, very big ones, some of them rather small and very focused ones for specific domains or tasks, some regional. There's huge, some existing for many, many years and having become increasingly secure, having matured over the process, some very recent ones. And it's these ones that we want to learn from. And here I want to briefly now start introducing the 4 problem areas that we want to address. And for the first one, I'll hand over to Martin, who's responsible for shaping that one.
Hi, I hope there's no echo in the virtual room. Yeah, I'm Martin. I'm also part of this working group, or future working group. And I'm addressing a problem, the first one. It's about technical blueprints of those theories. And these implementations of theories existed for decades. So there are some architectures, some social architectures, diagrams, but also technical ones, but they're just not accessible to us. These theories, they operate for so long, but they don't usually publish peer-reviewed material that we can see. So we want to find out how they're actually implementing parts of the theories, and we believe somehow they're very similar. We believe we talk about the same concepts, but they're just called a little bit different. So the problem that we address is that there is no real community-agreed blueprint of such a theory, a technical blueprint, that contains building blocks that are core, that are necessary for every theory, but also some optional parts or different flavors of these components, and best practices, but also kind of anti-practices or near misses or near potential catastrophes that you will never hear from. Yeah, so we want to gather information on this topic to have a comparable infrastructure, basically, so we can a theory also, 2 theories, they can compare it and they can say, okay, what are we actually talking about? How can we learn from each other? Yeah, and that's it.
Thanks, Martin. And once we have addressed that, any questions to that in the room or from the audience?
It's an interactive session.
Yeah, I know, sorry.
Can you stand up, please?
Yeah, sure. Not easily though. Part of your problem might be that I know us personally, like we would have to go through an approval process to share the blueprint for our infrastructure, and you know, maybe it's probable that the most important pieces of it, the part that make it really secure, would not be shareable. So sometimes these are things that we have to actually just talk about with somebody whom we know and trust to be able to say, like, yeah, these are the switches we're using, and this is the design we've implemented, and these other kinds of questions. So it's just something to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm. Sure, we are aware of that, and I guess, I mean, that's a problem that we can't get around with, but 2 hopes here. One thing is we won't publish the specific TRE specification or technical setup of any specific TRE, but sharing that information in a kind of trusted environment. And I hope we are kind of a TRE, at least a trusted discussion environment here, especially on-site. And once you're streaming to the world, it's a bit more risky maybe. But we hope that we can create such an environment within this working group where we can share such information orally, aggregate it, and then share it anonymously. Apart from the fact, and here I have to put on a second hat with a bit of research background in security, security by obscurity is the one concept that has shown not to work very well. And so the risk of revealing infrastructure setup is usually less than is perceived. But I agree, there is limitations that we have to face, but I hope that we can at least share it anonymously. And we never talk about our own infrastructure, but one infrastructure that we know very well, where we have seen such and such design, that should allow to share certain properties and setups and characteristics.
I guess just to follow on from that previous question, but would any components, these building blocks, be commercial in nature?
Very frequently they are. Very frequently they are. But basically what we have, so what we did, what Martin did for one of the setups was do a purely open source based blueprint setup. Not that one would deploy it as such, but basically we're talking about conceptual components, firewalls with certain controls, network segmentation, separating certain properties, access mechanisms via virtual desktop, remote desktop concepts. Which concrete technology you use is then a secondary question. An important one still, in terms of throughput, maintenance, and so on. But I guess we need to separate between how do you design such a thing, and then whether you set it up in a Windows or Linux environment will have certain technical decisions that follow from it, but the principles, I hope, should still be comparable. And the same for roles, and which roles are mutually exclusive, or the processes, the approval processes. How is data being transferred from one? Which checks are being performed for a safe export? So we will be referring to the 5 safes model. That is, at least in my opinion, but I'm open to suggestions, a very useful approach to structuring the thinking. And then abstracting from that, say, which controls do you put in place for a safe regress or for a safe reinsert? These, I think, can be shared quite technology neutral in a sense. Good. Anything online? No. Good. So, understanding, Rob.
I did stick my hand up. I don't know if you can see it. Just to add to what you were saying, Andy, in response to the previous questions. Yeah, detailed network diagrams of TREs are probably not something we would expect to get our hands on. But a higher level architectural view that we could all look at and go, yeah, that's a blueprint for a TRE. I think that's achievable. And that's based on some of the work we do in the UK at the moment. And I'll introduce myself shortly. And to the private sector question, if you like, there are plenty of TREs again in the UK that I'm aware of that are set up and run by private firms, and there are plenty of open source versions as well. And I think we need to be supporting both those aspects of the ecosystem, if you like. We shouldn't rule out commercial providers, but we should enable as broad an ecosystem as we possibly can. I think that's a goal we should have.
Excellent. Thank you. And that's actually a perfect lead over, because understanding the architecture and components paves the way to the next problem that we want to address, which is interoperability. And this is where I hand over to Rob to present.
Thanks, Andy. What a segue. We couldn't have planned that better, could we? So, interoperability. We are moving into a world, and we certainly see this in the UK and nearer Europe as well, of many TREs starting to exist, holding sensitive data assets, and a desire, nevertheless, to link these data assets together in the name of research. So we want health data from over there, we want education data from over there. They're both held in TREs. How do we make that as painless as possible for the researcher to access data in both those TREs? Well, they're going to have to interoperate at some level to enable this to happen. if we're going to adopt the data visiting model, we go to a reference library, we don't take the book out anymore, we read it there. We need to read one over there as well, but ideally we read them side by side. So that's the driver here. And we need some sort of federation of the users and the services, the TREs themselves, to make this work. Not identity federation, although that might help. It's not the only thing we need, though. But how do you send code from I'm an analysis TRE, maybe, and I want to send code to a data TRE over there. How do we do that? And cooperation, trust is going to be the key. So next slide, please.
Before you continue, can the central room be muted because it's terrible for the outside listeners?
The echo is quite substantial.
So the computer called Rodrigo must be muted.
I mean, I guess that's the room mic.
That's the room mic. Can somebody mute the room mic, please? This one.
Ooh, it's going to work. It's really, my echo's not so bad. I can hear myself, but I can ignore myself at the same time. But Lucas, your echo sounded worse, definitely.
It should be gone now.
Hello, testing. It's kind of not. No. There's another mic playing here.
Still there.
But I'm okay to carry on. I can ignore myself, but it may not be great for the folk online. I'll press on and see if the AV catches up. So some of the work we've done in the UK in recent years has sort of teased out some use cases that we're going to have to support for interoperability. And I've got 3 of them written down here. Bingo! Whoever pressed the right button there, that's fantastic. The echo has gone. Thank you for that.
Much better.
So the first one is kind of the way many TREs in the UK operate now. We call it data pooling, in that there's an approved project that's set up, and we don't have to worry about how that's done. There are approvals that need to be in place, of course there are. But then data are sort of gathered from external data TREs into one place. Maybe there's a linking spine that's needed from some indexing service as well to zip them all together, education data, health data. There's a common identifier of person there, but to do that safely and securely, you would use a trusted third-party indexing service to do it. Then you can pull it all in one place, zip it together, and then pass it to the approved researcher to say, there you go. So that use case, we need to support that. That's kind of business as usual for certainly TREs in the UK. Next slide, please. I can channel my inner Chris Whitty here, which is great. There are 2 use cases of federated analytics that we've been able to sort of tease out. And these are sort of abstracted, of course. So this is where we don't move the data, we try and send the query to the data. And you can either do it kind of directly, if you like. I call this direct analysis. Not everybody likes that, but there we go. Where, again, you've got an analysis TRE, and that's where your approved project sits. And you have machinery in place that enables it to send a query out to multiple other TREs for the results to come back into the project environment. Think of it, you can do this over using a Polystore database, for instance. You just present a remote view of multiple different data sources. And the query handler machinery is whatever it needs to be. And you can do that. There are plenty of products out there which will do this. Some of those products have been deployed in sort of sensitive data environments as well. So, we know this is doable. And next slide, please. And the third case is what I call indirect analysis, which is if the query is more complicated, maybe it's a workflow, maybe it's a set of containerized applications which have been approved to run, and that approvals is going to be part of the story. Again, you have the project inside an analysis TRE, and instead of sending queries directly to the data TREs, it sends a job request. and it says, hey, each of you guys, could you pull in this payload from that service over there, run it against your data set and send me the results back? So that's why I call it indirect. It doesn't send a query directly, it sends a pointer to a query, if you like. But that requires another service to be in play. And then this sort of job submission model, again, we've seen this in the UK. And the work we've done recently is to try and distill the UK picture into a small number of use cases as possible. And we finished up with these three. So for my money, interoperability, we need to be able to do at least these three things. So next slide, please. I think I've just got one or two more. So what do we need? Well, agreed technical standards, of course. We need network connections. We need encryption standards, probably public key certificate. Who's going to run that infrastructure? Good question. We've got to agree on the objects that we exchange. These are structured objects. There's a data type object, an index, a query, a response, payload. Do we need any more? Those objects need their own APIs, or maybe they need one API for a common wrapper. Let's try and keep these to as small a number as we need. Otherwise, our heads will explode. And do we want to try and agree standards for things like the query handlers, the index services, the software services? Or do we not try and mess with the ecosystem? Do we try and put in place standards just for the interoperability piece, objects, connections, and then leave the services alone to innovate in the same way the web works? The web works because of HTTP and XML. And you don't care whether you've got Internet Information Server, if that's still a thing, or Nginx or whatever. But we need trust as the basis of these things, because these services are going to have to be exchanging sensitive data potentially still. You send a query, it might be the equivalent of select star. So a sensitive data set might be going from one TRE to another. So they're going to have to trust each other. So who holds the keys? Who signs certificates? Who vouches for users? Who certifies the training and the skills of the users? Who looks after the standards? Who manages the changes to the standards? We need a governance model. That's fundamental to, for me, TRE interoperability. It's not just technical standards. There's a governance, there's an organizational piece on top. So my last slide, please. A quick view of where we are and state of the art in Europe, and hopefully you can get hold of these slides because there are links there. 4 things I was going to highlight. There's a Europe-wide project called European Network of Trusted Research Environments, EOSC Trust, which is trying to look at this in a sort of a transnational way in Europe. How do you network TREs together? My own day job is technical lead of the DARE UK program, which is addressing exactly the same question in the UK. My day job is worrying about TRE interoperability. A lot of my thinking comes from data spaces. Again, there's a lot of good work in Europe about exactly how do you do this? How do you share data between organizations that don't necessarily have a natural reason to trust each other, but nevertheless they want to collaborate? So how do you maintain sovereignty while data sharing? A lot of good design thinking there. And there are digital public infrastructures around the world. My favorite is X-Road, which arose in Estonia. It's now used in other Nordic countries and places like the Dominican Republic and around the world. But the ideas from digital public infrastructures, I think, are a big win in terms of not having to design everything from scratch when it comes to TRE interoperability. And I will stop there. Thank you for indulging me. Lucas, I don't know if you want to add anything or whether you disagree with anything that I've said.
Not disagreeing at all. That was excellent, Rob. Maybe just to add 2 more things to make it even more complicated. If the data are shared between different TREs, it's typically also international data transfer, so across countries and across legislation. So even though we are a rather technically oriented working group, that is also something we're keeping in mind. So that's one. And the second thing is there are 2 different perspectives to look at this. You can look at this at the perspective of a data provider and the perspective of a researcher or user, and that's typically not the same. So that's also a perspective that we're looking at. Thanks.
That's a very good point that Lucas makes. When we say user, we automatically think of researcher end user, but there are two very clear classes of user in this space, and the other is the data provider, you know, and the tension between those two. Our job is to try and understand and resolve that tension and make everybody happy. No pressure.
So
Now,
now
of course,
you're on
we
mute,
can't hear you.
Andreas. Hey, technology. The room is still on mute. We cannot hear the room.
Unmute?
Yes, now it's good.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm Claudia Medeiros. I'm from Brazil, and I used to be a diehard data researcher, only going to data conferences, computer science conferences, and I saw the light. Okay, so now I'm in this community, but I still keep looking at papers and presentations from the other side and one of the things that has been done lately, not for safety or security, but because of volume of data and what can we throw out, is to create data summaries that are explicit enough that they contain almost everything, and at the same time they would be secure for sharing. So how does that, but the goal is not, let me tell you again, the goal is that there's so much data in the world nowadays that sooner or later we'll have to start throwing things out. So how do we keep everything even though we throw things out? That's the goal of these researchers. How could this apply to us? These techniques that are being published in computer science conferences.
Try to give a shot at it to start with, and Rob, Lucas, you jump in. So I agree, there's lots of methodologies from data abstraction. You can insert noise into data, there is synthetic data. So there is a lot of mechanisms how you can make data less privacy sensitive or less confidential to allow more open sharing. That's perfectly fine. This is one approach, but there are settings where you need to work with the actual real life data, and where also, in some settings, even the researcher needs to visually see individual data samples in order to understand the problem, to formulate the research question correctly. And so there is never a 0 and 1 decision, you know, data is public or data is locked away. There is lots of gray zones in between. And what we need is mechanisms. We have a lot of mechanisms for sharing open data, and that still needs to become the standard culture, but we have the mechanisms out there. We have mechanisms for abstracting and synthesizing data and so on, and they serve that need. And we have solutions for the very, very secure data where you need to work with the real life concrete data. And we want to focus on that part of the spectrum. Okay? And even in that part of the spectrum, there is not a 0-1, there is not a TRE or not TRE decision, but TREs that serve different levels of sensitivity or confidentiality with specific controls, okay, different flexibility, and so we work in that spectrum.
Okay, thank you. So, because you mentioned visitation at some point, right? So that would be a kind of an umbrella concept for what you were talking about.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So this is mostly data visitation settings. Code comes to the data, but also as Rob just pointed out, also sharing, if in some cases it's necessary to bring data from two different places together in one place, which then again is a theory where the data visiting happens. So there might be sharing between trusted entities in order to allow data visitation by less trusted or larger number of whatever researchers, communities. So it's that spectrum that we're trying to address.
Just as a mention, I'm part of the Artificial Intelligence Data Visitation WG, so we might have things in common that we should discuss. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. I was following that one, and that was one of the questions that I had. You know, what are the specific requirements from AI and how we can incorporate them in terms of whatever, federated learning, things like that, absolutely. So we would very much appreciate input and collaboration on that aspect.
Just a comment from me, that's a very hot topic in the UK, so it's really interesting to hear from the work you've done there. I think, as Andreas says, one thing the data visiting model kind of gives you is it stops you copying data lots of times, which in terms of storage and too much data is sort of a win in itself. And the TREs that I know of, that I work with, even if you move data, it's ephemeral. You move it for a particular purpose for a time-limited project. It's not a permanent, copy. It's a temporary copy, and it will be thrown away once the project is finished. So I think the data visiting model helps us get a handle on the data explosion. Also, there's a lot more open data than there are sensitive data, until perhaps you start to look at things like genomes or medical images, and you think, actually, maybe those problems of scale are still going to hit us in due course. But I think there are lots of people worrying about this. And in terms of management of scale, globally, I look at people like the particle physicists and the astronomers who've solved this 20 years ago, and I think there are other communities that we should be learning from. Absolutely true. Not quite as sensitive, perhaps, but
data out there, industry data, that would be extremely valuable as a source for research, but where I fully understand that industry partners can just share the data with researchers. We are not sufficiently trustworthy as the broad community as such, to make it openly available. So I think that these concepts that we can borrow from domains that have used those, social sciences, medical sciences, if we bring them out into a broader constituency, that it would enable a lot of additional new research that is currently just not possible.
On that topic, if I can add something, Andy, a lot of the thinking around data spaces came out of industrial thinking, particularly in Germany and France, in Europe. A big driver behind, we want to collaborate and share data, but we don't trust you. So the data space idea of data sovereignty, that came from the German automotive industry, sort of VW wanting to collaborate on sensible things with Audi, but not wanting to share all the details of their crown jewels. So there's already commercial thinking that's come in that I think everything's coalescing in a really useful way. And I think I'm optimistic we can distill something really quite sensible in this working group from where we are now.
There's no further comments and questions. We move on to the third problem that we try to address. And I haven't seen Willy online, so I'll present the third problem, which is risks. And there basically, we all understand, as we said, there is no security or non-security binary flip. There is different degrees of security. And if we make it ultimately secure, we lock it up in a concrete block and seal it somewhere on the ocean and make sure that there's nobody getting close to it unless it blows up itself. So that's completely secure but completely useless. We can't make use of the data. Putting it up on the web for everybody to grab might be very convenient, especially if it's fair, so that machines can grab it up directly, but it doesn't provide the kind of protection. What we want to understand is what are the risks in between and what controls can we establish to mitigate those risks. Being aware of the fact that each additional control usually will take away some flexibility or efficiency. And understanding where the risks are is something that I think is essential. And the challenge here is that those risks, we can conceptually discuss them, but everybody does it in their own box. And so again, sharing the risk models that we had would be a nice way of learning from each other. And specifically, and again, this requires a lot of trust, again, sharing things that almost went wrong or even did go wrong and were caught just in time before they became public. Because it's usually everything that happens looks so stupid the moment it did happen, but it's utterly unimaginable before it happened. And so learning from each other, and I guess this is where RDA really is a very beneficial environment, because we're not competing with each other. There is no publications that emerge from that or whatsoever. We can share those stories, anonymize them, abstract from them, but provide them as anecdotes and guidelines at the same time. And so coming up with something like a risk register, a risk catalog, security issues that we became aware of, and structuring that somehow in typologies, I guess might provide a very valuable guideline for other theories to improve their controls, mitigate risks differently, and learn from each other. So this is the third problem that we want to address. We had a fourth problem up on the agenda when we met at the last BoF session in Salzburg, which is fair research data management for sensitive and confidential data, analyzing what kind of metadata about sensitive and confidential data can be shared and what is the security or confidentiality risks that this sharing of metadata brings with it. And again, we think it's an extremely important topic. We did not find anybody to volunteer to take over coordinating this activity. And so the debate in the group was, we have 3 already extremely challenging topics that are a lot of work to address. And so for the time being, we decided to push that backwards, not because it's less important or less interesting, it simply was a matter of resources. If anybody feels very fighting and interested in that topic and willing to push the discussions and the calls that we'll need in order to discuss these metadata issues and analysis and considerations, we would love to see this being taken up. But again, it's all a matter of resources ultimately.
I'm not volunteering, but just to bring that straight out.
I ignore that part of your statement. Continue.
I am not volunteering. No, but there's the sensitive data interest group. Would you be able to sort of outsource some of that to them, or are they doing anything that might be useful there that you could make use of?
I'm sure there is a lot of active work that we are in contact with that group and trying to see. This is an interest group that is producing, as far as I know, they have some generic recommendations. We would love to see this really addressed as a catalog. When they're willing to pick it up, either within that group or here, I mean, completely open, obviously. Yes, very, very welcome.
Might be good to organize some kind of joint call or
meeting,
whatever,
yeah.
just to discuss it in more detail.
Rob, you wanted to comment on that, or?
Just to observe that, so I'm a member of the data interest group, and I think the group's been very quiet recently. I think it may have suffered from the curse of RDA, which is we all try and do these things, many of us in our spare time, and there often isn't enough spare time to go around. But we could perhaps try and join up and support each other mutually in pushing things forwards, absolutely.
Raising levels of fairness in health research and health research performing organizations. I could maybe...
You have a catalog?
Well, we did landscape analyses and some recommendations from that, but as an output, but it's something I could speak to you maybe about.
Would be interesting. So if you think there is a viable chance of producing such a catalog by, again, pulling together a number of people who are maybe first working on in that working group, who might still be interested in pushing that forward to the next level, please do let us know.
The working group was established on the back of another EC-funded project called Fair for Health that finished a few years ago. But yeah, I was in that, and I was a co-chair for this working group. But I could speak to you maybe later.
That would be interesting. I mean, ultimately, that's the challenge that Rob mentioned. It's basically work that either has to be funded by other sources or be done in our spare time, and that's the challenge. Yeah. But if we can find people who are interested or who are doing it as part of any other funded or paid activity, that would be really, really cool. Because I think it's a very important topic to address. Rob?
Just on that topic, there's a very strong fair group, if you like, within the EOSCEN Trust project in Europe. And so some of these ideas may come through the EOSCEN Trust, where people do have some funding to push some of these ideas forward. So I sit in that project as well, on the fringes of Europe, as we are these days, sadly. So I can track that as well.
Challenges that we face with this working group. There is a lot of activity on these issues, at least that we are aware of within the European environment. And that's partially due to the fact that the last 2 plenary sessions were held in Europe, Gothenburg and Salzburg. That's where you meet the people, that's where you discuss those ideas. And that's where then the groups form that write some text and then spin off the activities. What we are utterly lacking is a solid understanding of what is happening outside of Europe. And the world is pretty big. Activities are likely very, very similar, but again, slightly different in each of the regions. So if we can get a few people who are interested to bring in their perspective and background, or at least the connections to the various regional TREs, because it's much easier to call somebody that you know and talk to them if it's about trust, rather than receiving a blind call or email from some random guy somewhere in Europe saying, could you send us your architectural specification of your TRE? I guess that wouldn't even be forwarded for approval if it arrived that way. But if somebody whom you know calls you, and that would enable a lot of the communication. So we're really very strongly looking forward to getting people who would sign up and say, we'd love to join co-chairing, co-organizing, coordinating some of these activities that we have foreseen here. So if any of you is interested and has some spare time, it's not a lot. I mean, we won't be doing weekly calls or things like that. But if some of you is available to invest some time into that, I think it would be really useful for the entire community. So this is and I'll repeat that statement at least one or two more times. Good. So, planned working group activity. And the 4 problems that we've just seen, presenting the text as we have it in the case statement document. This is linked from the group session, but I assume not many people have read through it before joining the meeting, so we'll go through it, and then we go for the activity plan and the discussion. So just to recap, we prepared a draft of the P20 and specifically P21. We sent then the revised version to TAP on July 10th, received feedback mid of September, and TAP feedback by the 1st of October, and I'll show you the TAP feedback that we got as well and the community feedback. We have then been discussing that feedback, and the key challenge was, again, and still is, we need some more international representatives on our organizational level, and we would really, really look forward to. We are in contact with people in the US and Australia, calling them, but it's nice if it comes really from the RDA environment, because then it's people who really know what RDA is all about and how we are working. We try to pull them in, but many of them were hesitant and said, yeah, we'd love to co-chair, but what is this RDA thingy? And what does it mean to be a co-chair of a working group and all of those issues? That's the challenge we're facing, pulling in people who are not aware of what this whole environment is. And the RDA is a pretty complex beast to explain to somebody who has never encountered it. There are thousands of people working voluntarily without funding and getting together once or twice a year. It's an amazing concept, but quite mind-boggling to many not familiar with it. So I'll present the text here. The bolding, highlighting is not in the original document. Obviously, it's just for increasing visibility a bit, and maybe we can share.
The room's gone mute again, I'm afraid.
Conflicting and maintaining control over sensitive and confidential data or IPR protected data, while striving to give third parties access. We refer to it as trusted research environments. They're also called secure research environments, secure compute environments. There's slightly varying terminology with slightly varying connotations, but we tend to summarize them under theories for the sake of the working group. So working group should be, or is planned to be called trusted research environments for sensitive data. And again, we might discuss whether this is sufficiently comprehensive, but we didn't want to call it sensitive and confidential data, it just broadens it too much. So subsuming it under this term, to understand a better understanding of the elements and the processes and the boundaries that we need to bridge across. And ultimately, the goal is to enable fair access and use of data in such restricted settings. Background, we rely heavily, and again, this might be a European bias and there might be other documents, but the ones that we are familiar with, that I'm familiar with, is the TRE green paper from Health Research Data UK that outlines the 5 SAFEs models, which I think is a very nice guiding principles. And that's kind of the conceptual setting that we're using. We do not consider pure job submission systems where you have data stored somewhere and somebody sends a job there, processes the data and sends the job results back. That has certain characteristics of a TRE, but TREs are more complex and we want to understand the more complex setting in general. But it doesn't preclude such settings to occur in TRE environments. Yeah.
This is probably just for me, but what's the difference between a data safe haven as well? I've just forgotten. Is that different?
Data safe havens is another term that is...
But it's essentially the same.
It's very simple, where users go in its data visitation settings with additional controls around it. So checking what comes out from the safe haven as a result, so secure export, verifying the projects that are being run. So data safe havens not always implement, not all TREs implement all of those controls, basically.
A quick comment in the UK. Data safe haven is kind of a synonym for TRE. It's much favoured in Scotland, where I happen to live. So Scotland has a network of data safe havens, which are all TREs. So one of the challenges we have is terminology here. I mean, secure data environment is a term that the National Health Service in England have introduced and are promoting quite strongly. Secure processing environments is a European health data space term. These things are all, as Andy said, they're all kind of the same thing, and nobody really agrees on the definitions of any of them. So I think if we're flexible in just interchanging 3-letter abbreviations, I think we'll be okay.
But this is why we need to understand the blueprints, the technical and the architectural, the processes and the interoperability issues in order to understand what the differences are, no matter what people call it. And I tend to love the term research environment because it focuses on doing something with the data and not just a secure data storage or a data haven where you send the data to live happily ever after. So that's you know, emotional aspect of how you see it. But yeah, that comment.
Is the remoteness a critical element of your definition? Because I know all these countries have actual buildings where you have to physically go and it's not always remote access. So would that be in your definition too? Is the remoteness a critical feature?
I wouldn't exclude it by definition because it shares a lot of the same controls that you need to put in place, because even if you physically visit a site, do some analysis, some machine learning train a model, you still want to take the model out. Whether you carry it out physically or electronically will still require very similar checks. You still need to apply to be able to allow it to be look at the data, which again needs to be you being established as a safe person and so on. So I think the controls are very, very similar. It changes a few of the technological measures that you have to put around the environment. So I wouldn't really fully exclude it. It shares a lot of similarities. I'm just checking and seeing whether people in the background are nodding.
Absolutely agree. Yeah. I mean, it's a matter of where you put the terminal. Is the terminal on a user's desk on their home office, or is it in a particular location? But it's still a terminal with a connection to some back-end system. And you know, if you look at things with a holistic view of the 5 safes, you might be able to relax some controls because you've increased the strength of other controls by adopting a safe seat, as it were. So it's all part of the same picture for me.
Oh, okay. It's just to point out that coming from Brazil, it's one single word. Safety and security are called segurança, which makes it very hard from time to time to explain to students the difference. Okay? And the way, at least I explain it, is that safety includes the human factor, whereas security would be purely technical. And I don't know if I'm correct in this or not, but when you watch movies, you know, one person asks the other, can I go there? Is it safe? They never ask, is it secure? Okay, but that's just my interpretation. However, in Portuguese, there's no difference. So if you want to move to a Portuguese vocabulary, it would make your life easier.
It will also make my life much easier in many other respects because I wouldn't understand anything else. Reminds me of a time when I had to once give a presentation with my slides having been translated into Portuguese. I was completely lost. Good. Moving back to the slides. So we found that they are similar in architecture and technical design implementation. However, the lack of openly available guidelines and explanations on design decisions for setting these things up is something that we want to address. And this comes especially to the point when we want to talk about federation across SREs or TREs, when they should trust each other. And this is where having a clearer specification will obviously help the work. And so we want to understand where the similarities and differences are in the interfaces. The charter, data holders struggle to make sensitive data available. And as a result, data is often completely sealed off. I can't share it, so I close it. And we want to enable more data access in using those mechanisms. And we also want to understand, and this is still a leftover of the sphere metadata that we want to discuss, how to reveal non-sensitive metadata to make it findable and transparent access to sensitive data. So understanding and harmonizing the concept of TREs. And so the problems, again, the technical blueprints, technical implementation and processes would be extremely helpful if we had them, understanding what the building blocks are, not necessarily how the parameters in configuring them are properly set up, but what are the building blocks, what are the control mechanisms, in order to make it easier to reduce the complexity of setting up such an environment, and in order to be able to more easily compare those environments, which then will help preparing for interoperability. Interoperability, this concept of data visiting, understanding what are the commonalities. Can I trust your theory? Does it have at least the same, does it at least have this, oh, see the camera. Does it at least have the same controls in place so that I can trust you to transfer my data to your location, or that we can at least allow a model to access data in both locations? What are the controls that we want to have in place? If you have verified a user to grant access to the data, is that sufficiently detailed so that I can incorporate that user and allow that user access to my sensitive data as well? So it's these questions that we want to address. And for the risks, balancing the risks of data disclosure, utility of the environment, and mechanisms to control these that we want to think. And so creating a shared catalog of risks will be useful in order to consciously decide whether I want to accept the risk, whether I need to mitigate it, or I need to block a certain type of access or mechanism because it's too risky for the given data. And so here we hope to learn a lot from lessons learned and near failures observed. Fairness, as I said, not addressed yet, but we have indications that there might be volunteers picking up that topic. Outputs. Outcomes, outcome one, a shared understanding of the functional components, processes, identifiers, and roles in an SRE theory setting. That's the primary outcome for the first problem statement. So working definition of what components are needed, an architectural blueprint, process diagrams of how to get data into a theory, how to have a safe egress, what kind of checks to apply, how to check on a person being admitted to the different types of controls, and having that as clear diagrams so that we can then map each individual TRE can then map its implementation to the blueprint and see which controls they have in place, which ones they might be missing, which ones they might put in place, which ones are there but do not appear in the blueprint. So are they useful? What purpose do they serve? In order to get a better understanding of that. Output 2 is a shared understanding of the context of user federation and interfaces across TREs. What are the APIs that we need to have in place in order to allow and support the 3 use cases that Rob was presenting first? How does a payload of code move to a TRE? What kind of checks have to happen? We won't obviously be able to specify the one API that will allow the generic transfer of code. That's very, very clear. But getting closer and making it easier for 5 TREs that want to cooperate, so here is the things that we need to specify. And here is the API definition that we need to come up amongst ourselves. I guess that would already be a big achievement. Rob, does that match what you would be aiming for? I mean, the generic standard for all TRE interoperability won't be coming out within 18 months from this working group.
Sadly, no, I don't think it is. But any step towards that goal, got to be good.
Put 3, a catalog of bad actor threat models. What are the threats that we are facing? And the bad actor might just be a sloppy researcher, not necessarily an adversary who is trying to attack and steal the data, because most research data is not valuable enough to sell it for sufficient amounts of money to go into exile for the next 30, 40 years. But avoiding, painful mistakes that usually happen, or that too frequently happen, of whatever laptops being left in the underground and things like that. So understanding worst case scenarios, data losses, data breaches, and similar aspects that we need to consider, and create a topology about these and share this risk catalog. So what we want to bring together is predominantly infrastructure providers, TRE operators on the one hand, and researchers who are using TREs, who want to or who are working with sensitive data, confidential data, data owners who want to share data, and in the middle, the data stewards and the staff that helps run and operate and activate those activities to make the data accessible and usable. Value proposition. We will demonstrate how results obtained on such closed data can still be reproducible and transparent, even if the data is not uploaded to a public repository. How we can share a clear public metadata record, simply verifying whether a researcher really had access to the data that they claim to have access to is already one step in that direction, for example, as a simple fruit to pick. Supporting the findability of data, and understanding what are the rules for requesting access to the data if I want to verify a claim that was made by another researcher. For the researchers, it's a better understanding of the similarities and differences between TREs, which will make it easier for us to request access if the procedures are comparable, and if I can find the TREs that host the data that I'm interested in. As a data steward, we might learn from each other the contact points on the other side and share information, share knowledge, and make it easier to run our own operations more professionally, establish legal interoperability. And as a data holder, data provider, it really gives us a clear sign of how we can make our valuable, our sensitive, or our confidential data accessible and usable to research. That would be the focus here. And as an infrastructure provider, obviously, we benefit from shared knowledge about the threat models, about the operations, about the controls that we are setting up, so that we really can provide professional services to our community. There is other activities inside RDA, and here we list a few of the working groups that we are monitoring, following, and where we are planning to integrate content from. If you are aware of any working group that is missing up there, please let us know. Enter it into the collaborative notes document so we can pick it up. The RDA has grown to a size where it's impossible to keep track of all the activities and all the outputs that are being produced. How nice were the days when we knew every single working group by heart. So Trust Principles and Adoption Working Group, Artificial Intelligence and Data Visiting Working Group, the Virtual Research Environments Interest Group that has certain guidelines there, and FAIR for Virtual Research Environments Working Group, the Sensitive Data Interest Group, and a number of domain-specific groups, such as the Health Group, or in general the Health Sciences, and also outside the RDA context. There's a number of initiatives that we are monitoring where we have actually people signed up in the working group already. There is about 110, 120 names on our miserably moderated internal mailing list that we were using for preparing this case statement. If you're not on that list already, send us an email and we'll add you to the list, and I hope we will very soon get an infrastructure where you can then self-sign up via the RDA environment, even if the working group has not been approved yet. Deliverables that we are aiming for. Deliverable 1 will be a blueprint document, a document that has architectural diagrams, technical architecture, social architecture, process diagrams, and some explanations to that. And then maybe, as part of mappings to some of the core infrastructures that are part of the working group that are willing to show how they are mapping or how they are implementing specific controls from such blueprints and how they can differ from a reference model. This should not be a standard model that people need to follow slavishly, but it's a blueprint that one should diverge from according to the specific needs, but to provide guidance. Yes, please.
So I was just wondering whether you could elaborate a bit on indicators of trustworthiness. In particular, are you talking about trust between things or trust between people or trust of people into things and stuff like that?
So trust is ultimately a social construct. So it ultimately has to be people trusting. In this case, I guess the people aggregate then to different roles. So institutions that are operating those things, if we want to interoperate, then our two institutions need to trust each other, which has the personal trust plus a bit of organizational overhead on top, and technical controls underneath. Researchers or data owners need to trust the environment in order to be willing to deposit it there. And so there's a lot of trust mechanisms on the social level. We can never guarantee social trust, but we can provide the mechanisms that form a basis for establishing social trust. And that has a lot to do with the mandate, the business model, things that go a lot beyond the technical aspects. Although I think for the working group aspects, we will be focusing on the technical and organizational means, not necessarily on business model and perception and marketing of infrastructures and web design, which is which is underestimated how much that contributes to trust. Same content, same institution, two different website designs, and the trust perception at first glance is very, very different. So we want to keep that social aspect very likely a bit beyond.
Oh, that's outside. A pity, because I was actually going to say perception is really important. So it's not just that your theory has to be trustworthy, but trusted also means it's seen as trustworthy. So I think that's a very interesting aspect, but I'm not volunteering.
Not yet.
I fully agree. It's very interesting. I think in terms of RDA speak, the low-hanging fruits are at the technical and organizational level. That would not be very low-hanging. I mean, I'm very interested. We are doing work in that direction, simply understanding the impact of having the picture of a person next to some role changes trust levels completely. But that's not something that we are currently considering addressing unless somebody volunteers to drive that activity. Again, merely because of lack of resources rather than downplaying it in terms of its importance. Good. Interoperability recommendations, concepts on the interfaces, basically. So social technical interfaces, identity federation and the architectures, how is it being done? It won't be new concepts that are being invented here, but how is it being done between those institutions that do collaborate, and how can others learn from it and make collaboration easier? Legal compliance checklists, again, to some degree as far as possible, again, won't be able to cover the entire world because the legislation is just too different, but at least the core components to check and the stumbling blocks. Identifying the legal stumbling blocks that hinder interoperability already, I guess, is a big step forward. And best practices. How can we deploy such things? What is the software that we can use for federated computing? What federated learning environments are demonstrated to be useful and are being in use? Those kind of guidelines. D3, a risk catalog. Again, catalog of bad actor threat models, bad hat scenarios, security levels. Can we come up with, different degrees of security requirements and then map these to the threat models that we want to see? Because, risk modeling is something that is very common to many of those institutions. ISO 27K is a risk-based approach to operating such a compute environment. And what I would love to see is collecting worst-case scenarios of data losses, data breaches that have either happened or that were stopped just in time or that were played through as a hypothetical use case. All three of them, I think, are extremely useful for us to learn from. Timeline. And this is where we start now a bit to cringe because that's going to be tough. We're thinking, months 1 to 4, let's collect as much information as possible, get in contact with TREs, asking them to provide us with information on the risk models, on the architecture, on the interfaces that they have, on interoperability that they already support between sister organizations, whatsoever, as much information as we can get. Some of it in Europe might be driven by some of the funded research projects. In other countries, we might need to reach out and rely on the people contributing, trying to get that information on the ground. Months 5 to 8, consolidating that, structuring that, mapping that, playing it back to the institutions. Did we understand your architecture correctly? Would your architecture fit into the blueprint? Or are you doing it entirely differently? And if so, why? Because if somebody's doing it entirely different, there must be there's usually a reason behind it, and usually it's a good reason. So learning from that. And then actually a pretty long time foreseen for consolidating the information. Increasingly abstracting from it, narrowing it down, and then having concrete recommendations that institutions can be encouraged to follow. Maybe even core concepts that are a must. You need to check on who the person actually is. Just don't do self-sign up. 2 more optional components that with an explanation of what kind of security guarantees they provide. That will be the time frame. So, but that all is from the moment we will be starting. That's when the clock starts ticking. And personally, everybody's saying, when shall we start and how quickly can we start? I always say we can start today, even if we're not an approved working group, because if the topic is of interest to us and we start collecting information, nobody keeps us from doing so. And that also points in the other direction. We don't need to press through the working group approval in the next month. We don't need to get the starting tick point by January. Okay? So I'd rather take a bit more time to get a bit more feedback, fine-tuning the expectations so that we have a clear case statement. And then let's start 5 months from now, 6 months from now. We won't lose any time because we can start working with it anyway. So the community feedback pointed us to the Artificial Intelligent Data Visitation Working Group, which we are aware of, and that's being monitored. There is the co-data policy committee that we need to monitor. There was a worry that by talking about sensitive data, we would be opening a Pandora's box. And yes, that might be the case, but some boxes just need to be opened because just keeping our eyes closed doesn't help us. So I think, yes, we should dare to open and pinpoint some of the tricky questions, even if we cannot solve all of them. Knowing that there is a problem that is open and unsolved, I'm sure there's some researchers who will be interested in solving it. Legal research, ethics research, whatever. Doesn't have to be technological. So I think we will be pushing forward that, even if that's conceived as a risk. TAP feedback pointed us to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And we agree we need to see how we can incorporate that and how it makes a meaningful connection to it. And then the really critical point, and I should have highlighted that in red here, that it's important to secure early commitment from regions beyond Europe. And yes, that's the weak spot that we are very, very much aware of. We assume likely grounded in the fact that there is a lot of activity on that in Europe, and the last two plenaries were in Europe. So this is really a call outside to the community. We have established contacts with people in Australia and so on, but we need to have somebody who is actually willing to co-chair and co-run it, and who has an interest in it somewhere down here, gut, heart, wherever the important parts of the body are. Because we all understand conceptually that's important, but we need to burn for it in order to drive this. And this is what we are looking for. And I saw a hand raising that indicated somebody to volunteer. No. But you're still allowed to raise your hand, sorry.
So I'm not volunteering, but well, sort of.
I always bad at
and I
hearing
sort of
initial
am.
statements. The microphone is never on immediately.
So I'm not volunteering, but so I am talking on behalf of RDA Tiger, and this is something that RDA Tiger can help with, finding the international component. And we do have a continuously open call for this type of support, and we would be more than happy to help with that.
So we'll definitely contact Tiger. That's also on the to-do list. Yeah, what we would help with is nudging the people. We have the contacts. We can even send you a list of contacts who found this all very interesting. We had calls and who commented on the document. And I said, would you be willing to add your name to the list to help co-facilitate the calls, or simply help doing calls when it's midnight in Europe or 1 o'clock in the morning in Europe? Because if we want to do global, finding one time zone that fits all doesn't work. And that's the hard part that we still need to master. So if you have any support on that, anything that might, any thumb screws. And
We are experts at chasing people, so we can do that for you.
Yeah, tigers, they're hunters. Good,
Thanks.
Thank you.
I was going to say we should do a swap, because in the uptake of infrastructure, digital research infrastructure interest group, we're all Australians and we need other people. But anyway, so what I was going to suggest was, if you've said you've already got some contacts in Australia, what we could also do is, if you send us a bit of a blurb, we could potentially circulate that through some of our networks that work in this field. Doesn't necessarily give you people, but it might, well, who knows, it might give you people, but it might also give you people you can talk to about your questions in terms of, your information gathering. So if that's something you're interested in,
sure. And any kind of information flow is highly, highly welcome. Yes, thank you. And if you know of any people that you might want to volunteer, we'll keep it anonymous that you volunteered them. But I mean, seriously, not joking. If you have contact points, put the names into the collaborative notes, because then we can reach out to you much more easily. Yeah. I mean, we have the case statement.
Yeah,
up,
so
and
we can circulate that, for example, and just say, look, there's this new group in RDA, and we can tell you more about what RDA is. But if you're working in the TRE environment, can you provide information? Are you interested in driving this forward?
Yeah. So what I will request from RDA, and I'm not sure whether that's possible, whether we can get a space that is like a group space already, with a mailing list, with something where we can store the documents.
Sorry, but you can have a working group at this stage, unless they've changed their policies dramatically since we did it. You can just set up a group. It doesn't have to be endorsed yet. There's a status, prior to submission or under tab review or whatever, and you can just do that. And that gives you a space where you can actually recruit people and that you can point to.
Yeah, because then we can also share the slides much more easily, because last time we had to send them out via email addresses. We typed off those emails from the paper documents that were circulating in the room. Obviously, we couldn't read all the email addresses, and so yeah, that would be great if we could get that space, and we'll see that we get that up and running. Other comments? Good. There was a pointer to the CARE principles, and yes, we're aware of them. We need to take a look at how far they relate to the actual work that we are doing. They apply definitely as trust concepts. There was a pointer to the RDA interest group on indigenous data sovereignty. I still need to understand how that would link, or what kind of input we could get from these. but definitely something that we didn't have on the radar so far. We need to take a look at. But again, the key challenge is broadening the community, and that includes also this interest group on indigenous data. I'm not aware, for example, if there is any specific TRE environments where such data is being hosted, trusted by the community, so that the trust aspects, as far as I know, working with ethnomusicologists in Southeast Asia, the trust concepts are very, very different in different communities. And so understanding these will be helpful for establishing trust, which goes beyond the technical infrastructure. But here we need to see whether we stick with or limit ourselves to a more structural, more technical organizational aspect, and how far we reach into the social dimension of trust. And now, the crucial point, who is interested in joining? Who is on the mailing list already from the previous BoF sessions? Half. You received some of the emails. we chased you somehow. Okay. Please put your email in the collaborative notes if you want to receive an update of what is happening. That's the easiest way for us. And that also applies to the people online. Please put your comments into the collaborative notes document and your email addresses. And then we'll send it, once we get the working group established, or at least the space in the RDA web space, we can then contact you, and then you can self-sign up or unsign if you have heard enough of us and say never again, which I hope I didn't ruin it all now. Good. So, and then I need to take a look at the time. How are we doing? 6 more minutes, which is perfect because we are at the end of the slides. Any comments on can the goals be achieved? Do we have the resources needed? Is there anything missing that you think we should address? Is there anything that you found confusing in the way it was phrased? Or everybody perfectly happy and signing up with their life and 80% of their work time for the next 24 months on the subject? Yeah. Good. So what we will do is we'll try to collect and incorporate the feedback from the discussions today. We hope we'll receive a few names and pointers. We will incorporate that into the case statement. We'll then send it out again via the mailing list first, incorporate the feedback, then submit the revised version again to TAB, where it will go through community feedback again. And whether we launch the working group before the next virtual plenary, or more likely just after the next virtual plenary, at least in my opinion, doesn't make much of a difference. Rob, Lucas, Martin, do you see anything that would keep us from doing that, or is there any timeline pressure from your side?
Nothing from my side. I think we're in pretty good shape. I think we could get it out there fairly quickly, depending on feedback and what the TAB might have to say. Somebody unmute the room.
And so I guess we can just use the time and then have a quicker start once. So stretch the first 4 months of information gathering a bit by starting before the 4-month clock starts ticking, basically. That would be my suggestion. Yes?
Yeah, I agree. Also, we can start immediately and don't need to be yet an endorsed working group.
I definitely don't want groups, and I'm dead tired, okay? But what struck me, 2 things struck me in your plan. The goals are great, but right before the goals, or deliverables are great. The first 2 goals seem to me a little bit vague in the wording. Okay, so you might try to be more straightforward in vocabulary choose. In your schedule, you might describe the first 2 stages would interact, so that as you gather data, you can pass on to the second stage, and then you go back and gather more data. And that would make it even richer and more feasible and harder to achieve, of course.
No, that's definitely a good point. Absolutely. Yeah, this is not going to be a waterfall process. Yeah, that won't work. But yeah, making that clear is definitely something we need to incorporate. That's, yeah. For the other thing, sorry, it's going to be a fun working group. You, even if you're that tired, we'll make you awake again. It's different fun. I'll keep working on that. Good. Any other comments before we head over to coffee to make us awake again? But at least, or lunch. Well, lunch comes with coffee, yep. Well, at least nobody fell asleep, so that's already good. Yeah. Volunteering.
Okay, so I was just saying to Martin, so the RDC has a page on trusted research environments, and in fact, there's an activity that has delivered a national trusted research environment framework, and it talks about a common blueprint, offer best practices, etc. So I don't know if you've seen that already. I've put the link to the whole page into the notes, but that might certainly be part of your information gathering process.
Absolutely.
And this comes mainly out of the health area in ARDC, which is the People Research Data Commons. But yeah, have a look at that, and we can certainly put you in touch with people in that area if you need to.
That would be really cool, because since they're doing or have done that activity already, they might also be very, first of all, capable, but also interested in sharing that knowledge globally and aligning on those levels. So we might even get somebody to volunteer from that subgroup.
I have not volunteered for anything.
No, we might get somebody to volunteer. You have volunteered to get us in contact with them and maybe nudge them a bit.
So that I can certainly do. And I mean, we're always interested in sharing our knowledge globally, as you know, so happy to.
So, perfect. Very optimistic. Good. Any further things? Anything else? Rob?
Just a final observation from me. I think we may find that there are more sources of information to draw from than we might expect. I mean, I know of tons from the UK. I know quite a few from Europe now. It's great that we get some from beyond that environment. Well, our challenge might be having too many useful starting points. But as you say, that'll be kind of fun.
The session. Hope you will enjoy the working group. Hope to see you at the next whatever meeting it is, a virtual one or a physical one, whether it's a BoF or a proper working group kickoff meeting or an interim meeting. And until then, enjoy your lunch.